Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Strange World. This is the 61st film in the Disney animated canon. I do think this is kind of part of a interesting kind of trend in animation, specifically animation, mostly Disney, but not entirely, of animators wanting to do things like old pulp adventures like Jules Verne, Edgar Rice Burroughs, and it feels like culture at large has little to no interest in that, and culturally we never hear about that stuff ever. And I'm curious, is there like a classic Cal Arts that's like forgotten pulp adventure things that they're all these directors animators are in, and they're like, yeah, I'm super hyped, and like the general public isn't interested in this. And as much as like they bring their visual panache and inventiveness to these stories, I often wonder, like, who is this for other than the filmmakers? Now, I don't mind these filmmakers going into their own weird auteur things, which I think happened with both Atlantis and Treasure Planet. This is by Don Hall, who doesn't have as big of a name, but he did co-direct Moana with John Musker and Ron Clements, as well as he directed Big Hero 6. And he seems to be the adventure director at Disney. Basically, that's like his thing, I guess. And this is, I guess, his take on sort of a Journey to the Center of Earth thing, but instead of doing one of those tales, it's kind of this own original thing, and it's very original, actually, which I kind of think is actually one of the cooler things about it. It's like an entirely original idea. It has twists you wouldn't see coming. It's weirder in certain places. It's not even taking place on Earth. It's like a weird, different planet that I'm not exactly sure what it is. It takes on these, different ideas and does interesting things with them. And I was kind of surprised. I liked an adventure film. Like, I think I like this more than something like Lightyear this year. Now, I don't think it's this is a strong animation year. And I don't think it stands out as much, or even as much as the film he made or put out at least last year, Raya. But I still think it's so kind of different in what it's doing, and so into what it's doing. I can't help but be sort of compelled by it, and compelled by its vision, and compelled by somebody who wants to share this kind of story with all of us. In this world that's basically a land that's surrounded by mountains, there's a famous adventurer called Jaeger Clade who's climbing these mountains to discover new things, and he has his son Searcher. At one point, his son wants to look at these plants who he thinks could be something, and they're glowing, but he wants to go on, so he goes on without him, and Jaeger goes on without his team, and his son and that team make that into a power source which powers this whole land and everything like that. And he disappears, basically. We don't know what happens to him. The power source starts to go wrong, similar to the reasons for Moana, actually. But he goes wrong and decides to go on a journey with his son, who is openly gay in this film. And if they were to cut it out, it wouldn't be like the normal thing where it's just one scene at the end. They would have to cut out several scenes. They'd have to do a good work editing. I think you probably could, but at least, when they put it in the editor program, there'd be several markers and not just cut out that thing at the end or whatever. It's like he is openly gay, and the film doesn't hide that at all and brings it up numerous times. So it's actually some progress here. This is actually some progress. This is actually, I know people joked about it when this came out, but it's literal progress here, so I will commend them for that. We could do more, but hey, they actually did more than they usually do, so I guess I'm satisfied in a way. But he decides to go on this journey. He's just been farming and making this research as a power source, and they've had amazing technology in this land, and they have to go on a journey to figure out what's going on. And then when they go into this land underneath the mountain, they find his dad, and they kind of journey to figure out what is wrong with their power source. Basically, that's a lot going on. And this is very much into, it's more complicated than Edgar Rice Burroughs or Jules Verne or anything like that. This is what I would call hard fantasy sci-fi, but they do try to make it more centered on the family and less this crazy concept, because it's not Earth, they sort of, it's this total different thing. It's this odd concept that's like, oh, well, he came up with this thing and his son made this power source and it like powered everything, and like, where are they? And like, they're not really interacting with other people and stuff. They're just in this weird land that seems to be very big, but not. That part is interesting, and that they seemingly have like pulp adventure stuff somehow. They have a printing press, I guess, or something, and this is based on pulp stuff, but it seems more pulp comics. And I also wonder, like, a lot of these directors were not like I think my dad's generation was maybe the last one who really got these, like, given the books given to them as kids and stuff like that. And a lot of these directors are like Gen X, and I just didn't. Anyway, I'm very confused by all this. And like, Missing Link was another one who I like Missing Link a lot, actually. But like, why are we telling these stories to kids at this point? It's bizarre, but I do think like this is the kind of film that, like, a weird fantasy thing that I would be really into as a kid, and like nobody else, so you can tell it's very popular. But it has a lot of fun with the animation, it's particularly the creatures. Like, it does feel like you're in a weird world when you're underneath and figure out where the dad went and everything. And you do see this kind of generational idea of like, it's almost interesting to think of like what you think of masculinity, because you think of someone like Dennis Quaid from one generation, Jake Gyllenhaal from, I guess, my generation or something, even though this is like a fantasy, and then the son, who is entirely different from masculinity. And I do think that's really interesting how they took on that. It's just so many concepts going on with it, but it doesn't like kind of choke under that. And I think it's because Don Hall is like a seasoned pro at this point. This is part of the Jennifer Lee era of Disney, and a lot of that, or at least the films we've seen so far, I think Frozen 2 starts that era, I believe, which she directed, where you're dealing with the generational trauma or the mistakes of a previous generation that your new generation is now correcting, and or dealing with the faults of other generations and stuff. And I think this film plays into that maybe more than the other ones, but it is interesting that most of these times there is a crisis to deal with, and this crisis was started by a previous generation. You can probably read into that. This one is more dealing with the generation who started the problem, I guess, because it's more from Jake Gyllenhaal's perspective, but it's probably one of the better adventure films because I was much more into it than the other ones. I was much more like following the characters, I was following the world, the concept was stranger and surprising. Most of them I get kind of, you're into, and I know the characters, and it's a good adventure, but I felt like this, it's like had a bit more going on, and I don't know, I might have to watch this 3 or 4 million times or something like that, and maybe my interpretation of it will change, but it did feel a lot denser in ways and surprising, and it kind of showed me Don Hall's a lot stranger between this and Raya, and I think Raya, because it didn't feel all that original, and we don't need to get into all that, but it did feel like it was something you sort of seen before. This felt like something he had already seen before, and maybe you've seen before, the stories, but then it went into like these odder places that I didn't expect, and that I did find really interesting. And I did really like how the creatures in the world were like weirder and stranger, and the squishy guy who they're like, oh, I want to market you and stuff, like that was very funny. But the idea that they looked at these creatures in a different way, and that like does lead to something, but it felt like they were having more fun with the animation and CG. It felt like the idea of what a pulp adventure should be and the idea of what adventure is changes for generations, and maybe the point of having Strange World be in more of the pulpy style is that style, and how this adventure started was based on his dad, and that was maybe that is the point. But I do find this to be an interesting slot in the Disney animated canon. I do think it's interesting because I think they're more known for the sing-songy stuff and less for things like this, even though like Raya was a year ago. I respect that they still do stuff like this. You'd think because Disney is so kind of on it in terms of the franchise that this would be the thing that just went to Disney Plus. Maybe financially it should have, maybe it would have worked out better in that sense, but I don't know. This is definitely one of the ones where I was like, I don't know if you knew you could make money with this, but I respect that you actually made it. I think it's probably a better adventure film, probably one of the better adventure quest kind of films I've seen this year or in the last little bit. You know, I think it is a better film than we're all giving it credit for, and I think in a little bit people will look back on this a lot more fondly. I applaud them for putting out an interesting product and kind of going into a genre and maybe re-examining it and doing different things with it. I don't know if that's a genre or a kind of storytelling that means anything to anyone at this point. I don't think it holds as much water and enough to make an animated film about like this. And I think that's maybe sort of the disconnect with all of these, is because like, hey, I like it, but like I'm old and weird and like, you know, nobody cares what I think, except for you guys. You viewers are great. But I hate the phrase when like, who is this made for? And I think film, you know, you look at a story like Encanto, and if you just told the story of like this family in this house, that doesn't sound that interesting. But because Disney's so good at storytelling and the songs and all this stuff, it's amazing and lively and beautiful. But like in this, I do feel like the directors and Don Hall, I think especially, and this was also written by Kwai Negan, who co-directed this and also had a major creative role in Raya. I think they sort of knew this was a difficult one, but unlike something like a movie like Eternals or something, which is Disney but not Disney Animation obviously, that film sort of like was being the weird, difficult movie, and this is like knows it is and is trying to make that as narratively clear as it can, because the Disney writing process and creative process made it as such. But I respect them for like, let's make a weird movie, but like let's make it palatable for kids and families and stuff. And this was a good family movie. We had a good family movie night with this. I'm interested in Don Hall now. I'm more thinking of him as a director after this, and creatively, and his team, and like what else they would do. I don't know if they'll get to make another adventure kind of action film after this, but I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. There are a lot of beautiful visuals in this, and this was a far more interesting film than people are giving it credit for. And I think that interesting films kind of live on because you can talk about them and you can go, hey, you know, did you see Strange World? And like, what was going on with that? And like, what's with this thing? And that was kind of strange. And I think of often recently, everything out, everybody thinks when they grew up in pop culture was like totally weird. And like, you know, it was so weird growing up in like 1988 or 1989 or 2000 or 96 or 9, what everybody thinks when they were a kid it was like this unique time in popular culture. And I don't know if any of those years actually are or not or were, and some of them maybe were and actually were, but I do think this is one of those films where people will go back and go, yeah, that was, and like there was this thing, and like I do think this will inspire imaginations in ways that I don't think we are fully grasping yet while we talk about the finances of it. I think there's a little more going on here, and it was a much more interesting take and probably one of the better takes on this material to make it there for an audience. Probably tried more than a lot of those films did at getting people in, and it wasn't trying to be hip, and it wasn't trying to do anything like that. I think it really was trying to make a weird-ass, strange fantasy story for, you know, for today and for today's audiences. So if you have seen Strange World and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.